The cruelest thing about being loved in silence is that the person you love often mistakes your devotion for something that will never disappear. For 9 long years, Evelyn Carter stood exactly 3 steps behind the Alpha King of Blackwood, close enough to hear every quiet sigh he tried to hide from his court, yet invisible enough that no one ever wondered if she had dreams of her own. Every morning before the castle bells echoed across the valley, she was already awake, preparing the reports he preferred to read with his first cup of coffee, making certain the council chamber was warm before winter winds slipped through the ancient stone walls, and checking that the medicine for the wounded guards had been delivered before sunrise painted the eastern sky in pale gold. No one asked who had done these things because they simply appeared, as though the castle itself took care of its king. That was how life had always been. King Damien Blackwood never demanded perfection, but somehow everyone worked harder whenever he entered a room. He ruled with calm authority instead of loud commands, earning respect from every alpha across the northern territories. And although countless noble women dreamed of becoming his Luna, none of them noticed the quiet Omega who stood faithfully behind him through every victory, every treaty, every winter, and every lonely celebration. Evelyn never expected him to love her. Somewhere during those first months, she had accepted that her feelings would remain her own. Loving him became as natural as breathing, woven into the rhythm of each passing season. She remembered the day she first arrived at the royal castle, barely 20 years old, carrying little more than a leather satchel and a letter of recommendation. Damien had smiled politely, thanked her for accepting the position of royal healer, and spoken her name with genuine kindness. That single moment had been enough to convince her that spending her life protecting him would never feel like a sacrifice. Years passed faster than anyone realized. She celebrated his birthdays from across crowded banquet halls while pretending she preferred the quiet corners. She watched visiting dignitaries praise his wisdom, listened as young warriors swore loyalty beneath the full moon, and stood beside him after exhausting council meetings when everyone else had already gone home. She learned every expression on his face. The slight crease between his eyebrows meant he was worried but unwilling to admit it. The almost invisible smile in the corner of his mouth appeared only when children laughed in the palace gardens. She knew when he skipped meals, when old memories kept him awake, and when he silently carried burdens too heavy for any king to share aloud. Yet despite knowing everything about him, there was one truth Damien never saw. He never noticed how her eyes searched for him in every crowded room, how her voice softened whenever she spoke his name, or how she quietly let every opportunity for another life slip through her fingers. Until one cool autumn evening, when the last golden leaves drifted across the palace courtyard, Evelyn folded a single letter, placed it carefully on the polished oak desk inside the king's private study, removed the silver crest that marked her as a royal servant, whispered a gentle goodbye to the only home she had known for 9 years, and walked through the castle gates without looking back, never realizing that by sunrise, for the very first time in nearly a decade, the empty chair beside the throne would finally force the Alpha King to notice the woman who had always been there. The following morning began exactly as every other morning had for nearly a decade, except that something almost too small to notice had quietly disappeared. Damien entered the council chamber carrying a stack of reports beneath one arm, while exchanging polite greetings with the advisors already gathered around the long walnut table. The fire crackled softly against the stone fireplace. Warm tea waited beside his chair, and every document requiring his signature had been arranged with careful precision. Nothing appeared unusual, yet an unfamiliar feeling lingered somewhere beyond his attention, like a song whose final note refused to fade. He sat down, reached for the first report, then paused without understanding why. The chair beside the eastern window remained empty. It was always occupied before he arrived. Evelyn had never once been late. Lord Harrison cleared his throat and began discussing trade negotiations with the neighboring pacts, but Damien found himself glancing toward the doorway more than once. Perhaps she had been delayed at the infirmary. Perhaps another healer required assistance. The meeting continued for nearly 2 hours before Damien quietly asked, "Has anyone seen Miss Carter this morning?" Several council members exchanged puzzled looks. Finally, an elderly clerk adjusted his glasses and answered with an uncertain smile. "I assumed she was with your majesty." Damien nodded absent-mindedly and dismissed the thought. Throughout the rest of the morning, small inconveniences appeared one after another. A messenger delivered incomplete records because nobody knew Evelyn had already requested the missing pages the previous afternoon. A young guard arrived with a fever, but the medicine cabinet contained only half the herbs usually prepared before sunrise. A visiting ambassador waited nearly 20 minutes because no one realized Evelyn normally adjusted the schedule to prevent overlapping audiences. None of the mistakes were serious. None threatened the kingdom. Yet each one left behind an invisible gap that no one could explain. By early afternoon, Damien finally walked toward the royal infirmary himself. The familiar scent of dried lavender and fresh cedar filled the quiet halls, but every shelf stood perfectly organized without the gentle presence that had always made the room feel welcoming. One of the apprentice healers looked up nervously as the king entered. "Where is Evelyn?" Damien asked with calm curiosity. The young woman lowered her eyes. "She left, Your Majesty." Damien smiled faintly, assuming he had misunderstood. "Left for the village clinic?" The apprentice slowly shook her head. "She resigned yesterday evening." Silence settled across the room. Damien stared at her for several long seconds, certain there had been some mistake. Evelyn would never leave without speaking to him. She had dedicated almost half her life to Blackwood Castle. She knew every corridor, every family who depended upon the crown, every tradition that held the kingdom together. She belonged here. "Did she say where she was going?" he finally asked. "No, Your Majesty." The apprentice hesitated before adding quietly. "She only thanked everyone for letting her work beside people she admired." Damien turned without another word and walked back through the castle corridors at a slower pace than usual. Servants greeted him as always. Sunlight poured through stained glass windows exactly as it had the day before, and distant laughter echoed from the palace gardens, but everything felt strangely unfamiliar. When he entered his private study, his eyes landed almost immediately on a single folded envelope resting neatly in the center of his desk. His name had been written across the front in handwriting he recognized instantly. For reasons he could not explain, Damien did not open it right away. Instead, he stood motionless beside the window, watching autumn leaves drift across the courtyard where, only yesterday evening, Evelyn Carter had quietly walked away while believing no one would ever notice she was gone. Damien closed the study door behind him, shutting out the distant sounds of the castle until only the quiet crackle of the fireplace remained. The envelope rested in his hands, surprisingly light, as though 9 years could somehow be folded into a single sheet of paper. He recognized Evelyn's careful handwriting immediately. Every report she had ever prepared carried the same elegant script, steady and unhurried, never demanding attention, yet impossible to mistake for anyone else's. He broke the seal with unusual hesitation before unfolding the letter. There were no dramatic farewells, no accusations, no desperate pleas for him to change his mind. The first line alone made him stop breathing for a moment. "Your Majesty, thank you for allowing me to spend the happiest years of my life serving this kingdom." His eyes continued slowly across the page. "I have always believed that loyalty should be freely given, never expected. You have given me purpose, kindness, and a place to belong, and for those gifts I will always remain grateful. But, somewhere along the way, I forgot that I was also meant to live a life of my own. Please do not search for me. I am not leaving because I am angry. I am leaving because staying has taught my heart to wait for something that was never promised. I sincerely hope you find every happiness you deserve. Thank you for letting me love you, even if only in silence." Damien lowered the letter without realizing he had reached the final sentence. The room suddenly felt much larger than before. He replayed those words again and again, convinced he had misunderstood them. "Love you." The phrase refused to fit beside the Evelyn he thought he knew. She had always been composed, thoughtful, dependable. Never once had she crossed the invisible line between duty and personal affection. Or had she? His thoughts drifted backward through years he had never questioned. The winter evening she stayed awake beside his office until nearly midnight because he had skipped dinner during treaty negotiations. The spring festival where she quietly stepped aside when noble daughters competed for his attention, smiling as though she truly preferred watching from the crowd. The countless mornings she somehow knew he needed coffee before he admitted he was tired. At the time, He had accepted every thoughtful gesture with grateful appreciation, believing they came from nothing more than remarkable dedication. Now each memory returned wearing a different face. Had she been speaking through actions because words would have changed everything? A soft knock interrupted the silence. "Come in," Damien answered absent-mindedly. His longtime steward, Oliver Bennett, entered carrying several official documents before immediately noticing the letter resting in the king's hands. "Is everything all right, Your Majesty?" Damien looked toward the older man. "Oliver, how long has Evelyn intended to leave?" The steward hesitated, his expression unexpectedly heavy. "I had hoped she would change her mind." Damien frowned. "You knew?" Oliver nodded slowly. "Not at first. She spoke with me about 3 months ago. She asked if I believed a person could spend an entire lifetime loving someone who would never see them." Damien stared at him in disbelief. "Why did you not tell me?" The old steward offered a gentle smile, filled more with sadness than judgment. "Because it was never my story to tell. She asked for nothing in return, Your Majesty. She only wanted the chance to stop hoping before hope became the only thing she had left." Oliver quietly placed the remaining documents on the desk before leaving the room once more. Damien remained alone, surrounded by silence that suddenly carried the weight of conversations he had never heard, feelings he had never noticed, and a truth that had apparently been visible to everyone except the one man whose opinion had mattered most. 3 weeks passed, and for the first time since Damien inherited the throne, Blackwood Castle no longer moved with quiet certainty. Nothing collapsed. No disaster struck the kingdom. The walls still stood strong, the banners still danced above the towers, and every member of the royal court continued performing the duties written beside their names. Yet beneath that orderly surface, tiny fractures spread through each passing day. Meetings began 10 minutes late because important reports were scattered across different offices. The royal kitchens prepared meals Damien never touched because no one remembered he always skipped breakfast after restless nights. Visiting families waited outside the audience chamber while confused attendants searched for appointments Evelyn had once memorized without ever writing them down. The castle had always believed it functioned because of systems, traditions, and authority. Only after Evelyn disappeared did everyone begin realizing that the invisible thread holding countless ordinary moments together had quietly walked away with her. Damien noticed it more than anyone, although he rarely admitted it aloud. Every evening, he caught himself looking toward the chair beside the library fireplace before remembering no one would be sitting there with a medical journal balanced across her lap. Every morning he instinctively reached for herbal tea instead of coffee, because she had once convinced him it helped him think more clearly before difficult negotiations. Even the palace gardens felt strangely unfamiliar. The roses still bloomed along the stone pathways, but nobody paused to trim the damaged branches before the gardeners arrived. Evelyn always had. She claimed healthy flowers deserved small acts of kindness before they needed rescue. At the time, Damien had smiled politely at the unusual thought before returning to work. Now those simple words echoed with uncomfortable clarity. During one council meeting, Lord Harrison struggled through a presentation that Evelyn had quietly perfected every month without asking for recognition. Numbers failed to match, schedules overlapped, and several regional requests had been accidentally overlooked. Frustrated voices gradually filled the chamber until Damien raised one hand, restoring silence. He stared at the unfinished documents spread across the table before asking a question that surprised even himself. How did Miss Carter manage all of this alone? No one answered immediately. Finally, Oliver spoke in his usual calm voice. She often remained awake after everyone had gone home. Damien looked toward him. Every night. Oliver nodded. Most nights. She believed it was easier to carry extra work herself than allow someone else to feel overwhelmed. Those words settled heavily across the room. No one had ordered Evelyn to sacrifice her evenings. She had simply chosen to. That afternoon, Damien wandered through the eastern hallway where the royal healers prepared medicines for winter. The shelves remained neat, but something important was missing. An elderly woman arranging bundles of dried herbs noticed him standing quietly near the doorway. "Your Majesty," she said with a respectful bow. Damien glanced around the familiar room before asking softly, "Has it always been this quiet?" The woman smiled with gentle sadness. "No, sir. Miss Carter used to hum while she worked. She said patients healed faster when rooms sounded hopeful. Damien closed his eyes for a brief moment. He could almost hear it now, the faint melody that had blended so naturally into the life of the castle that he had stopped noticing it years ago. The silence left behind was somehow louder. That evening, unable to concentrate on official matters any longer, Damien returned once more to his private study. His gaze drifted toward the map hanging across the far wall, where every village, forest, and mountain within Blackwood territory had been carefully marked by hand. For the first time since reading Evelyn's letter, he stepped closer to the map instead of away from it. His fingers slowly traced the roads leading beyond the capital, lingering over the quiet towns where healers were always needed. Somewhere beyond those borders, the woman who had spent 9 years quietly building his world had finally begun building one of her own. And for the first time since she left, Damien realized he no longer wanted to know where she had gone simply because she had been his royal healer. He wanted to know because the thought of never seeing her again had begun to feel far heavier than any burden a king was supposed to carry. At dawn the next morning, Damien left Blackwood Castle with only Oliver and 2 royal guards riding several hundred feet behind him. He refused the grand procession his advisors insisted upon, saying the kingdom would survive one king traveling as an ordinary man for a few days. In truth, he could not bear the thought of frightening Evelyn with banners, soldiers, or formal announcements. If she had chosen peace after 9 years of quiet sacrifice, then she deserved to see him arrive as Damien before she ever saw the Alpha King. Their first stop was the village of Ashbrook, where Evelyn had volunteered many winters ago during a terrible fever outbreak. The elderly baker recognized her name instantly, his weathered face brightening with genuine affection. "Miss Carter? She was here about 2 weeks ago. She fixed my wife's shoulder with nothing more than patience and a warm cloth. Refused every coin I offered." Damien thanked him and continued down the narrow streets, noticing something he had overlooked for years. Every person who heard Evelyn's name smiled before speaking, not because she held a royal title or carried the authority of the crown, but because she had left behind kindness wherever she had gone. By late afternoon, they reached another small town. Resting beside a clear river, outside a modest wooden clinic, children chased one another beneath maple trees, while several elderly neighbors sat comfortably on benches wrapped in handmade blankets. Damien stepped inside expecting to find Evelyn waiting beside shelves filled with medicine, but instead discovered a young healer carefully organizing herbs. "I am looking for Evelyn Carter," he said politely. The healer's face softened. "She stayed here for 5 days. She trained all of us before moving on." Damien glanced around the room. Every bottle carried neat handwritten labels identical to the ones she once placed throughout Blackwood Castle. Every cabinet had been rearranged for easier access. Even the fresh flowers sitting beside the windows reminded him of the palace infirmary. She had quietly transformed another place before leaving it stronger than she found it. "Did she mention where she planned to go next?" he asked. The healer smiled apologetically. "She only said there were more people who needed help than one town could ever hold." As evening settled across the countryside, Damien walked alone toward the riverbank. The cool breeze carried the scent of pine and fresh water, while sunlight faded into shades of amber across the gentle current. He remembered asking Evelyn once why she insisted on planting flowers outside every healing room. She had answered without hesitation, "Because recovery begins long before medicine works. Sometimes people need something beautiful to believe tomorrow will be different." At the time, he had nodded politely before returning to official matters. Now he understood she had never been speaking only about patience. She had quietly lived by those words herself. The following morning, their journey continued through another village where a little girl proudly carried a basket of herbs almost too large for her small arms. When Damien offered to help, the child smiled brightly and said, "Miss Evelyn taught me these leaves help people breathe easier in winter. She said everyone can heal someone if they learn one small kindness." Damien froze for a heartbeat. Those sounded exactly like something Evelyn would say, simple enough for a child to remember, yet wise enough for an adult to spend years understanding. As the little girl skipped away toward the village clinic, Damien remained standing in the middle of the quiet road, finally realizing a truth that humbled him more deeply than any lesson he had learned as king. While he had spent years believing Evelyn's greatest gift was caring for one kingdom, She had quietly become hope for countless people beyond his castle walls. And the farther he followed her footsteps, the more clearly he understood that the woman he thought he had lost had never been searching for a place beside a throne. She had always been searching for a place where her heart could finally be seen. By the fourth day of his journey, Damien reached a quiet valley surrounded by towering pines where wildflowers stretched across rolling hills like patches of sunlight resting on the earth. The village itself was small enough that every front porch held a rocking chair, and every neighbor greeted one another by name. Nothing about the place suggested royalty had ever passed through, yet the moment Damien mentioned Evelyn Carter, the faces around him lit with unmistakable warmth. "You just missed her this morning," an elderly woman said while arranging baskets of fresh apples outside her cottage. "She spent the night helping my grandson recover from a terrible cough. She refused payment, but she accepted a slice of pie before leaving." Damien smiled despite himself. That sounded exactly like Evelyn. She always believed refusing kindness was just another way of making generous people feel unnecessary. Following the directions the villagers gave him, Damien continued toward a small meadow overlooking a crystal-clear lake. As he reached the top of the gentle hill, voices floated upward with the breeze. He stopped instinctively before stepping into view. Below him, nearly a dozen children sat in a wide circle beneath an old oak tree while Evelyn knelt among them, laughing softly as she showed them how to identify healing herbs growing naturally along the hillside. She looked different, not because her appearance had changed, but because something invisible had finally been lifted from her shoulders. Her smile reached her eyes with an ease he had never noticed inside the palace walls. There was no royal schedule waiting for her, no endless meetings, no expectation that she would quietly solve everyone's problems before they became visible. She simply existed, and somehow the entire meadow felt brighter because of it. Damien remained hidden behind the trees, unable to interrupt the peaceful scene unfolding before him. One little boy proudly held up a handful of leaves. "Miss Evelyn, did I find the right ones?" She examined them carefully before nodding with genuine excitement. "You certainly did. Your grandmother will be very proud when you help make her tea tonight." The child beamed as though he had just earned the highest honor imaginable. Damien realized she had always possessed that remarkable gift. She made people feel important without ever making herself the center of attention. After the lesson ended, several parents approached Evelyn carrying small baskets filled with homemade bread, fresh vegetables, and jars of honey. She accepted each gift with heartfelt gratitude, thanking every family as though they were offering priceless treasures instead of ordinary food. No one bowed before her. No one addressed her by an impressive title. Yet the respect in their eyes surpassed anything Damien had witnessed inside the royal court. As the villagers slowly returned home, an older man remained behind beside the oak tree. Damien watched as he smiled at Evelyn and said, "My daughter told me you once served the king himself." Evelyn nodded gently. "I did." The man tilted his head with quiet curiosity. "Do you miss that life?" She looked across the shimmering lake before answering. "I miss many wonderful people, but for the first time in a very long time, I wake up each morning without wondering whether my heart is asking for too much." Those simple words settled over Damien like a cold winter rain. He finally understood what her letter had truly meant. She had not escaped the castle because she hated her life there. She had left because remaining beside him had slowly required her to silence pieces of herself that deserved to be heard. As Evelyn gathered her satchel and started walking along the narrow forest trail, Damien stepped out from behind the trees at last. He did not call her name. He did not rush toward her. He simply watched the woman he had unknowingly loved only after losing, realizing that the greatest distance between two people had never been measured in miles. It had been measured in all the words left unspoken while they stood only a few feet apart. The forest trail curved gently between towering pine trees, their branches swaying softly beneath the afternoon breeze as Evelyn walked without once looking behind her. She had learned long ago that moving forward required resisting the temptation to keep searching for footsteps that might never come. Her satchel rested lightly against her shoulder, filled with herbs, handwritten notes from grateful families, and small gifts children insisted she accept before leaving each village. It was a simple life, yet every sunrise brought a peace she had almost forgotten could exist. Behind her, Damien followed at a respectful distance, unwilling to shatter the quiet she had finally found. He had faced rival Alpha Kings without hesitation, settled disputes that threatened entire territories, and stood before thousands with unwavering confidence. But taking one more step toward Evelyn somehow felt more frightening than any decision he had ever made. Before he could speak, another voice called from farther down the path. "Your Majesty." Damien turned to see an elderly woman dressed in silver ceremonial robes approaching with the steady grace of someone untouched by hurry. It was High Priestess Miriam, the oldest spiritual guardian in the Northern Territories, a woman who had guided generations through moon blessing ceremonies. Her wise eyes rested first upon Damien before shifting toward Evelyn, who greeted her with quiet respect. "I wondered how long it would take," Miriam said with a knowing smile. Damien frowned slightly. "You expected me?" The priestess nodded. "Some journeys cannot begin until people stop running from truths they have carried for years." Evelyn lowered her eyes, clearly uncomfortable with where the conversation might lead. Miriam studied them both before speaking again. "Do you remember the Moon Blessing Festival 9 years ago?" Damien searched his memory. It had been his first official ceremony after ascending the throne. Hundreds of young wolves from every allied territory had gathered beneath the full moon to receive blessings for their future. "I remember the ceremony," he answered. Miriam smiled gently. "You remember the speeches and the celebrations. I remember something else." She reached into the folds of her robe and removed an aged journal bound in faded blue leather. The moon blessing records every destined bond witnessed by the priesthood. Damien accepted the journal carefully. Inside, neat handwriting filled each page until Miriam stopped at an entry dated exactly 9 years earlier. His silver eyes scanned the words before suddenly freezing. Beneath the names Alpha King Damien Blackwood and Omega Evelyn Carter, a single sentence had been written. "The moon has recognized this sacred bond. The path shall open only when both hearts choose each other freely." Damien looked up in stunned silence. "This cannot be possible." Miriam's expression remained calm. "It was never hidden. Destiny does not force love. It simply waits until people are ready to see what has always existed." Evelyn finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I asked her never to tell you." Damien slowly turned toward her. "You knew?" She nodded with quiet honesty. She explained everything after the ceremony. She said the bond would remain dormant unless both of us willingly accepted it. "I realized very quickly that your heart belonged to your kingdom, and I could never ask you to choose differently." Damien stared at her, struggling to understand the weight of what she had carried alone. "So for 9 years." Evelyn offered a small, bittersweet smile. "I never waited for destiny. I only hoped that one day you might look at me as simply Evelyn instead of the healer standing beside your throne." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves overhead as complete silence settled between them. Damien finally understood that fate had never failed them. The moon had spoken long ago, but while destiny had quietly opened a door, it had been his own unseeing heart that left it closed for nearly a decade. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The forest seemed to hold its breath with them as sunlight filtered through the branches, painting shifting patterns across the quiet path. Damien looked at Evelyn with eyes no longer clouded by routine or obligation. For the first time since they had met, he was not seeing the royal healer, the dependable advisor, or the woman who quietly solved every problem before it reached his desk. He was simply seeing Evelyn. The realization settled over him with painful clarity. She had never asked for the throne. She had never asked for recognition. She had only hoped to be seen. Slowly, Damien removed the royal cloak fastened around his shoulders and folded it over one arm. Then, without ceremony or hesitation, he lowered himself onto one knee before her. The gesture was so unexpected that Evelyn instinctively stepped back. "Your Majesty," she whispered, her voice trembling with surprise. "Please stand. You should not kneel before anyone." Damien gently shook his head. "Today I am not kneeling as your king." He lifted his eyes to meet hers. "I am kneeling as the man who failed to notice the person standing closest to him for 9 years." Evelyn's fingers tightened around the strap of her satchel. She had imagined countless conversations over the years, but never this one. Never with Damien speaking so openly, his usual confidence replaced by quiet honesty. "I thought serving you was enough," she admitted softly. Eventually, I realized I had built my entire world around someone who never knew he was the center of it. Damien lowered his gaze for a moment before speaking again. I cannot erase those years. I cannot ask you to pretend they did not happen. His voice remained calm, but every word carried unmistakable sincerity. What I can do is tell you the truth I only understand now. The castle feels empty because you are not there. My mornings feel unfamiliar because your kindness shaped them before I even noticed. Every road I have traveled these past days has shown me pieces of your heart that I should have treasured long ago. Evelyn blinked rapidly, trying to steady the emotions rising within her. Damien, she said quietly, using his name without his title for the first time in many years, do not mistake loneliness for love. They are not the same. Her words hung gently between them. Damien accepted them without protest. I know, he answered. That is exactly why I came alone. He smiled faintly. If this were only loneliness, I would have asked you to return to the castle. Instead, I am asking whether I might earn the chance to know the woman I should have known all along. A light breeze carried the scent of wildflowers across the meadow as Evelyn searched his face. She found no royal command there, no expectation that she would immediately forgive him, only humility she had never seen before. You are asking for something that cannot be given in a single afternoon, she said. Damien nodded. Then I will gladly spend more than a single afternoon proving I deserve it. Tears shimmered briefly in Evelyn's eyes, though she smiled through them. For 9 years I measured love by how much I could quietly give. Damien slowly rose to his feet, leaving only a respectful distance between them. Then allow me to spend the years ahead, learning how to give instead of simply receiving. Neither of them reached for the other. There was no dramatic embrace, no promise that everything had been healed in one conversation. Instead, they stood together beneath the towering pines as two people finally speaking with complete honesty. And for the first time since destiny had quietly written their names beside one another 9 years before, the path ahead belonged not to silence or sacrifice, but to a choice they would make together, one sincere step at a time. The seasons changed once before Damien returned to Blackwood Castle, and when he did, the kingdom noticed something different long before he spoke a single word. The Alpha King who once measured every hour by royal duties now visited neighboring villages without ceremony, listened instead of assuming, and spent as much time among ordinary families as he did inside the palace walls. Whenever people praised those changes, he never accepted the credit. He simply smiled and said he had finally been taught what true leadership looked like. During those same months, Evelyn continued traveling wherever she was needed, never because she doubted Damien's sincerity, but because she wanted to be certain she was choosing her future instead of returning to her past. He never pressured her. Some weeks they exchanged letters. Other times he appeared in the village where she happened to be volunteering, carrying supplies instead of royal decrees. Together they repaired old clinics, planted gardens outside healing houses, and spent quiet evenings listening to grateful families tell stories beneath skies filled with stars. Their friendship grew first, built not upon destiny or titles, but upon conversations they should have shared years before. Damien learned that Evelyn loved painting wildflowers whenever spring arrived, that she collected old books with handwritten notes inside the margins, and that she always laughed a little louder when children invented impossible stories. Evelyn discovered that Damien secretly enjoyed baking fresh bread despite rarely getting the recipe exactly right, that he remembered the names of every royal guard who had ever served beside him, and that beneath the strength expected of every Alpha King lived a man who had spent years carrying responsibilities so quietly that he had forgotten how to ask anyone to walk beside him. Nearly 1 year after Evelyn left the castle, the people of Blackwood gathered in the royal courtyard beneath the same full moon that had witnessed their forgotten blessing 9 years earlier. This time there were no whispered expectations, no political arrangements, and no elaborate displays of power. Damien stood before his people wearing simple ceremonial clothing instead of heavy royal armor. When Evelyn entered through the palace gates, dressed in an elegant ivory gown that reflected the moonlight, every person present rose to their feet, not because tradition demanded it, but because respect had already filled every heart. Damien stepped forward with calm confidence before turning toward the assembled crowd. There was a time, he began, when I believed the greatest strength of a king was protecting his kingdom. I was wrong. The greatest strength is recognizing the people who quietly protect your heart while asking for nothing in return. He looked at Evelyn with the same warmth she had once dreamed of seeing. For 9 years, she loved with patience while I lived without understanding the gift already beside me. She never demanded to be chosen. She simply chose kindness every single day. Today, I am the one asking to be chosen. Tears glistened in many eyes as Damien gently offered Evelyn his hand. This time she smiled without hesitation before placing her hand in his. It was not because destiny had finally forced their hearts together. It was because two people had freely chosen each other after learning that real love is never built upon silence alone. As the moonlight bathed the courtyard in silver, the kingdom celebrated not the beginning of a fairy tale, but the reward of two hearts that had finally learned the courage to speak. And long after songs faded and candles burned low, people would remember that the Alpha King found his greatest victory not on a battlefield or upon a throne, but in the quiet moment he finally saw the woman who had always believed love was strongest when it was gentle, patient, and freely returned.